You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is John Reeves. He is the author of a book which I picked up and absolutely could not put down. Soldier of Destiny, Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. Mr. Reeves, like all good scholars, has a master's degree in European history. He has taught European and American history at Lehman College, Bronx Community College, and London South Bank University. That's the university I want to go to, Mr. Reeves. I'd move to London tomorrow. The reviews, of course, are outstanding. I'm going to read the best review from probably the most brilliant Civil War scholar. James McPherson, Pulitzer Prize winner, says, Reeves has done a superb job. Mr. Reeves, thank you much. Mr. Reeves, thank you so much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're very grateful. I pay a lot of attention to subtitles. And when I have authors on, the first question, if I can remember, is explain to me why you chose the subtitle you did. Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant.
That's a great question because there's a lot there. Why don't unpacking it, we'll start with the redemption theme. And I think the book starts with him being forced out of the army for alcohol abuse out there on the Pacific coast in 1854. And over the next decade, he rises from, being forced out of the army to then becoming, in 1864, exactly 10 years later, the Lieutenant General, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army. So a tremendous turnaround over the course of a decade. So that's the redemption angle. But you could also say, too, he was redeemed on the slavery issue as well, because before the war, he was someone who benefited from slavery, and his wife owned 4 slaves. He worked on an estate outside of St. Louis that leaned on slavery to make their profits. And so by benefiting before the war and then probably being the main instrument for the destruction of slavery, Grant, I think he redeems himself in that realm as well. And then the secession point of view was not just a sort of an added item, but when Grant rejoins the army in 1861, the reason he did more than anything else, he was a Union man and he opposed secession. He had lived in St. Louis. He had been surrounded by secessionists, and he was someone who that was one part of the St. Louis culture that he couldn't adopt or embrace because he was ambivalent about slavery while he was living down there, but not the secession. And that's what made him different from those folks in Missouri.
Please grade the following statement on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being Vane, you've hit on something, mirabile dictu, 0 being Vane, you're a complete idiot. Why am I on the podcast? To me, Ulysses S. Grant, more than Lincoln, more than anyone else, is the most compelling figure of the war. Scale of 0 to 10, how right or wrong am I?
I think that it's 9 or 10. He's one of the top. He's one of the most interesting. And I think the thing that probably interests you and I and Grant, and also in at the time interested people, said he came from nowhere. So this was a guy who was a captain of a regiment at the outbreak of war. And one of my favorite anecdotes about Grant is after the great victory at Fort Donelson, they wanted to run a feature about this guy who just won this fantastic, and they pulled a photo, they pulled an image for a national publication of another Grant. They quite literally didn't even know what the guy looked like. So he came from nowhere, and just this gradual rise over the course of the war, coming from, for an officer, a relatively low level, all the way to the top. So that just arc in and of itself, and then you add the tenaciousness and the sort of the fact that people commented that he didn't even look like central casting, but he was kind of had a slouch and he's had a cigar in his mouth, and he wasn't someone you would think was the leader of an army. So anyway, I think his story is one of the most interesting in the war. And then I would maybe the one reason for me where Sherman is I think probably equal as another character, and I love how that, whether it was apocryphal or not, where I actually think Sherman did say this, where he said something like,
"I stand by."
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I stood by him when he was drunk, and he stood by me when I was crazy, and we stand by each other always, or something like that.
That is Sherman-esque in its own way. You mentioned, because there's so much to cover, but it would be fair, however, to say Grant came from challenging circumstances in many ways, but it's not like he came from abject poverty.
Yeah, and I think that's something I write a lot about for two reasons. One is I think it's important. One of the reasons why I wrote this book was as a character study. And I think that in order to understand Grant, you need to know that he didn't come from the bottom. In fact, he came from a prosperous family. His father was a successful tanner, but then an entrepreneur, opened up stores all throughout the Midwest. And his father knew that an education at West Point would be necessary for his son to rise in the world. And so that kind of not only was to Ulysses, to his father, was a beloved character who he tried to give everything he could for his personal development. I think that's an important part of the story. But then another part of it, too, is that Grant's father, Jesse, is a truly extraordinary American character. I just love. What's funny is that if you talk about the sort of the pull yourself up from your bootstraps, it was his dad that did that, not Ulysses. That his father, Jesse, had lost his mother when he was 11, and his father took to drink, and little Jesse got taken in by a family, and then later, as I said, built up this business, which in 1854 was worth between $100,000 and $150,000, which at that time was a tremendous amount of money. It's well-to-do by any standard. And in fact, in the small Ohio town, people used to get annoyed by Jesse because he expensive glasses and he would dress in that sort of thing.
Jesse Kardashian.
Yeah, so for small town Ohio, he was doing well.
Grant goes to what he distinguishes himself to a significant degree by his service in the Mexican War. And along the way, some of these men he was at West Point with, some of these men he fought next to. But the Mexican War is really, would you characterize it as a prelude to the Civil War? And how did the Mexican War change Grant? Or did it?
Yes, I think the Mexican War is critical to understanding Grant. And yeah, I think that the prelude to the Civil War is fair to the extent that we took on all this new territory and it led to the divisiveness in the politics. I think you can see a straight line from the crisis over the Mexican War and the results, straight to the Civil War. But for Grant personally, it was huge. In fact, he had a reputation. He's known as a silent guy and a quiet guy, except when the topic of the Mexican War came up. He could spin a yarn about that. And he would captivate his audiences, whether in Galena or St. Louis right before the war, talking about the various campaigns. By the way, I don't think that's nothing. His ability to remember what happened on the battlefield and tell it clearly and concisely, it was part of his leadership abilities during the war, his ability to give orders to his subordinates in a very straightforward way. So I think that was part of him. But then the one last thing I'll say about that too is it was crucial too because Grant met all the people that he would be fighting during the Mexican War, and he wasn't intimidated by them. He knew that John Pemberton was a bit risk averse, who he faced off with in Mississippi. And he also wasn't intimidated by Robert E. Lee because he knew of Lee. He had met him on an occasion in Mexico. These folks weren't mysterious people to him. It's interesting too that he was a quartermaster during the Mexican War and not a combat officer.
It's also fair to say, and this is Grant's opinion, which never changed, that the Mexican War was a disgrace.
Yeah.
We never should have taken on Mexico, and we did it in large part because of the slave power and them coveting more land, which eventually becomes true with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They can push all that, and Stephen Douglas, that's a podcast for another day.
Yeah.
Grant never defended the United States' actions to start the war or to perpetrate the war.
Yeah, that's one of the great features that's one of the greatest things about Grant too, is just this disarming honesty, because I think he said in his memoir something to the effect, not only was this a wicked war, but I was young. I probably shouldn't have fought for it, but I did because I didn't want to say anything. And I don't know, as you were when you're younger, right? Like he just went along with everything.
Like Robert E. Lee, I don't think ever expressed that opinion. If he did, I missed it. There, a lot of the folks who fought as generals in the American Civil War fought as junior officers in the Mexican War. And is it safe to say that Grant is by far the most critical of the United States in that war?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is fair to say.
Failure makes success more compelling and usually more celebrated. In between the time he gets out of the army, you said 1854, he's lonely. He misses his family, Julia. He's way out on the coast. He's got a kid, I think at least one kid he hadn't even seen yet.
Yeah.
Is it Jesse he hasn't seen yet, or Ulysses S. Grant Jr.?
It's Ulysses S. Grant Jr., who goes by Buck.
That Buck, that's right. So in between 1854 and let's just say 1861, the end of 1861, because he's about to take Donelson and Henry in February, I think, of 62.
Right.
How many times would you, as a scholar, say in the 1854, 1861, that Grant just flat out failed at whatever he was trying to do?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I would say I'm going to start with the period as a farmer. And I would say that's one of the biggest surprises to me in doing my research was I don't think that he was a failure as a farmer at all. In fact, I think he was pretty good. He was a hard worker. He understood what he needed to do. His father-in-law, who at first didn't like him, started giving him more and more responsibility. And by 1857 or so, was letting Grant run the 900-acre estate on his behalf, because the father-in-law was retired for the most part and was letting his son-in-law, Ulysses, run this huge estate, was managing all of the slaves, managing a lot of the decision-making about what crops to plant, et cetera, and make investments, what have you. The reason why that didn't work out was the Great Panic, a financial crisis of 1857, where the market went against them and his father-in-law was in debt. So that farm had a tremendous amount of debt. In order to pay the debt payments, when grain prices were high, it was a functional operation. But the minute when grain prices fell, they could no longer meet the debt payments on behalf of the father-in-law. And that's why Ulysses had to stop farming. So it really wasn't his fault. And so I note that in some ways, I think because when he ran for president, people love that kind of with Lincoln. Rail splitter to the White House sort of story. I think they loved poor Ulysses out on this dirt farm outside of St. Louis, struggling and not being able to make ends meet. But that wasn't quite right. Remember, that estate was actually a pretty well-to-do operation by the standards of the time. So anyway, successful as a farmer. When he went to St. Louis, however, then he failed. One of his jobs that he got after the farming position wasn't working was as he was with a property company. And among the jobs he had to do would be to collect payments from people, which he was terrible at. And his wife, Julia, would make fun of him that he would find ways to not collect the money from people. That was a sort of a more of an entrepreneurial job, and it wasn't real. He wasn't suited temperamentally to that sort of thing. And then he applied for another civil servant position there, and he was very disappointed that he didn't get it. He thought he would. And a German American got the position. And one of the few times, maybe not him at his finest hour, Ulysses felt, oh, yeah, of course, the foreign person got that position and not me. And it was at that time where he's just struggling to find a proper job in St. Louis that he finally gave in to his father, Jesse, and said, I will take a position in the family leather trade.
He was selling firewood on the street. He had people who had been his friends for decades or a long time didn't recognize him. Longstreet didn't recognize him when they needed a fourth to play some card game. And they said, and Longstreet was in Grant's wedding.
Oh, that's funny though about the firewood anecdote is that was during the period that he was farming in St. Louis. And one of the things that he was doing was clearing the land. And so he was cutting wood, and then he was very efficiently, let's use everything instead of, so he would go and he would often have enslaved people haul the wood to St. Louis, but sometimes he did it himself, which is, I think, to his credit, got it rolled up his sleeves. But you're absolutely right. Some of the military officers that were stationed out in St. Louis would one of my favorite stories is when one of them said, Grant, what are you doing? Because he had a wood and he was dressed as a farmer. And Grant said, I'm solving the problem of poverty. And they had a laugh.
Was it the 1856 election where he said they were trying to find out if Grant was a Republican or a Democrat? And he's in 1856. I voted for Buchanan because I didn't know him, and against Fremont because I did.
Yeah, that was the 56 election, and he did vote for Buchanan. And in 1860, he didn't vote, but even he admitted would have voted for Stephen
Douglas. Yeah. We are talking with author and historian John Reeves. We're discussing his new book, which is terrific. Soldier of Destiny, Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. Let's talk about the Dents.
Yeah.
So he marries Julia Dent. She is not necessarily, I don't know if you would call her a Southern belle, but she grows up in a Southern culture with Southern ways, even though she's not in Mississippi. Her dad is prosperous. They own dozens at one point of slaves. And it's safe to say that Julia Dent's father thought she could do better. How did the Dent family influence and help shape Grant between the wars?
Yeah, I think this is a central to his development in this period because, by the way, I think Julia really was a Southern belle, and she even carried herself like a Southerner, and she was spoiled, and she adored her father. And her father, Colonel Dent, was a real rascal, kind of an unreconstructed rebel.
Very pro-slavery.
Right, pro-slavery and all of it. And just a kind of a difficult guy, was always in legal trouble with this or that and causing trouble. But he grew up in this. Ulysses is part of this pro-slavery in-laws, and yet his birth family, Grant's birth family, was anti-slavery. And he's on one side where he's got Julia, who's pro, and then his father and his siblings who are anti. And Ulysses in the middle of this, and I think it caused a lot of tension for him. And like I said, I think his father-in-law had an ambivalent attitude towards Ulysses. On the one hand, he didn't like that he was a Yankee, but on the other hand, he grudgingly saw that he was a hard worker and he did a good job at the farm. And then when Grant gets promoted to brigadier general, Frederick then called himself the colonel, even though he didn't earn that title. Was saying he saw what brigadier generals made as far as money goes, and he got a little excited by that. So it's just a funny story. But I think there were real tensions in the family, and I think it was the move to Galena that resolved that conflict in Grant's mind. And it was from that point on that he was pro-Union, and then, of course, would go on to play that big role in ending slavery as the leading Union general.
You alluded to it earlier, and it appears in all the biographies or analyses of Grant's life. And I've read as much on him as I can digest for the reasons I stated a few minutes ago about him being compelling. But what you just said about the two families just reminds me, and what you said a few minutes ago about debt collection, about how confrontation adverse Grant really was, and how different that was from his philosophy on the battlefield, where you can only win through confrontation. Is that a dichotomy in your mind, or am I just reading it wrong?
No, I think that is an interesting angle on him, because you're absolutely right. In his personal life, he was conflict avoidant, I think would be a good way of describing his interactions with people. And I think probably his aggression on the battlefield was, it's funny, and people saw that in Mexico, is he was pretty brave. He was a brave person, and he was someone who, this in the book, one of the things that makes him, I think, unique among a lot of the Union generals is that he was very good at taking manageable risks. It wasn't reckless risks by any means, but it was risks where, for a little bit of risk, the potential upside was huge. And I think and I think that was maybe the mathematical side of him. And so he was someone on the battlefield was willing. You combine the bravery with his willingness to take manageable risks, and so I don't think it was so much that he was just this guy who wanted to slug it out all day. But I think he just was. That's what his view of war was, to defeat the enemy, and to do so, you were ultimately going to have to bring it to a conclusion one way or the other.
Would it be accurate or fair in your view to call the Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln marriage the most famous or most discussed during the American Civil War? And if so, is it okay if I place Ulysses and Julia right behind them? Because I really, and I've done a lot of Civil War podcasts. I used to give a speech to Civil War roundtables in the Midwest, actually, about the relationship between Lincoln and Grant. And when you read books about Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln never comes off well. She just doesn't. Even in the movie Lincoln, she doesn't come off well. There's always that little bit of praise to her or acknowledgement that without her ambition, she never could have sustained Abraham Lincoln's ambition. How did Julia affect the career of Ulysses S. Grant by just being his wife?
Yeah. One of the things I found was that she played a crucial role in his development. Number one, she was devoted to him. She was his biggest fan. Whenever he would get down, she wouldn't have it. And she would have pet names for him and called him her Ulysses, and even was telling people, were almost laughing in the 1850s when she said, watch it, he'll become president of the United States someday. So she had this devotion to him. But also, one of the things that she put her money where her mouth is too, though, is that during the war, she often took a lot of risks to travel to be with him and was in war zones. I often think about, in late 1862, she went to northern Mississippi to be with her husband, and there were rebels everywhere. And even on one occasion, she almost got kidnapped along with her enslaved nurse, Jewel. And they just missed it. They just missed being caught by rebel cavalry by 12 hours or something. So she was brave. She was a good, she could ride horses, and she was in, and she is one additional thing I'll say when you look at Julia as a mother, she would send off one of her children at 11 to go be with her husband. Once again, in a war zone, in a way that a modern day mother would probably never do. So Julia was tough in that regard too. And then the one thing I'll say too is that a lot of people feel that Julia was the one who kept him sober. And he was devoted to her too. And so I would say, I don't want to say one way or the other about Lincoln and Mary Todd. Ulysses and Julia really was a love story of equal measure, meaning they were both devoted to each other, and it somehow was a marriage that really worked.
And how did the fact that Julia grew up with slaves, around slavery, accepting slavery, in your opinion, did her views and maybe the views of her family color Grant's views on slavery? In other words, could he have been more of a abolitionist, for lack of a better term, on slavery if he had married, say, someone from Michigan?
Yeah, and that's one of those unknowable questions, because I would say, I think that I keep leaning on that word ambivalence, right? Because Grant certainly never came out against slavery. He didn't indicate that this was a topic that really concerned him overly much in the 1850s. And that's as hard as that is for us to admit nowadays, I think that's true. And with Julia, he benefited from slaves, right? So that allowed them to live a better lifestyle, and so then that complicated it too, right? People often point to, in 1859, Ulysses freed a slave named William Jones, and people often point to that as that shows that he really was anti-slavery. But I don't think so, unfortunately, because he could, under Missouri law, he could have freed Julia's 4 slaves as the husband in that partnership, and he didn't. And in fact, he hired them out when they moved to Galena in return for income. There's lots of evidence that he was not opposed to slavery by any means prior to the 1860s. And so I guess my point being is, would a marriage to someone else have? It could have, but I think it didn't. He didn't have to be convinced. In fact, Julia's sister has this great and cutting line where she said something to the effect of, he may or may not have been against slavery in the 1850s, but we didn't have to twist his arm too much to benefit from them while I was in St. Louis. So I think that kind of captures it, unfortunately, in the late 1850s.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is John Reeves. He is the author of a penetrating, very analytical book, Soldier of Destiny, Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. I've never read an article or a biography of Grant that did such a terrific job of explaining his relationship to slavery before the war. Before we go on, let me ask you, is there a Hoosier leader and or legend you particularly admire?
Oh, that's such a great one. One person that I loved as a Hoosier is Lew Wallace. He's an Indiana man, and his memoir is one of the best diaries, memoirs of the Civil War. And I don't think it gets as much recognition as it should. And it's not surprising. Of course, everyone knows he wrote Ben-Hur. So he's a gifted writer, but he has a real good eye for things. And I think remember, a lot of these memoirs are often quite self-serving, but sure. I think Wallace is honest, because Grant really did him dirty. He at least thought Grant didn't treat him well as Shiloh, and nevertheless, Wallace is very fair in his assessment of Grant as a leader and stuff. So yeah, I would maybe say him as one in particular.
There's an Indianapolis public school named after Lew Wallace about 2 miles from where I'm sitting.
Oh, wow.
Let's get to the war. Grant, everyone sees the war coming, especially when Lincoln is elected in 1860. South Carolina secedes, I believe, on December 20th, 1860. Other states follow. Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th. the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. What is Grant doing during this time that leads him back into the Army and eventually, because we will get there, to Fort Henry on the Tennessee and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River?
Yeah, so one of my favorite scenes in all of this, and if this could be right out of a movie, is right after Fort Sumter. They call a public meeting in Galena, Illinois, where they're going to hash this out. And we forget that back then it was not clear how the upper Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Minnesota, which way were they going to go, right? And there were a lot of Douglas Democrats, Stephen Douglas Democrats back then, that are these folks going to support the Union? And of course, it turned out that they did quite strongly, but at that time it was unknown. They had a meeting in Galena, Illinois, and who stands up but John Rawlings, who would later become Grant's chief of staff, and just gives this passionate defense of the Union and the need to stamp out this secession right now. And Grant walks out of the meeting and he turns to his younger brother, Orville, who he works at the leather store with, and says, "Looks like I'll be rejoining the Army." And Orville says, "I'll look after the store." And so it's such a great moment of where Grant makes his choice. And people who knew them said, Rawlins just gave voice to what Grant already believed, that Grant was someone who just was horrified by the move towards secession. He felt, despite his generosity at Appomattox, Grant felt that Jefferson Davis should have been hanged for treason. So he was not shy about seeing secession as a bad thing that needed to be stopped.
Davis I'm with U.S. Grant on that, even though it's very interesting. And Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederate States of America, in his memoir, I think it's his memoirs, Jefferson Davis has my favorite quote of the entire war, about the war, I should say, because his memoirs are written years after. Next to the defeat of the Confederacy, the death of Abraham Lincoln is the darkest day the South ever knew. Grant then quickly rises to command positions, even though he's frustrated because they don't really seem to recognize what they have on their hands. By that, federal government, the state government, and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But he eventually obtains a command. And let's talk about 1862 up to Shiloh, because to me, we can argue about this too. Shiloh is the most important battle of the war, in my mind. And I've had multiple Civil War scholars tell me I'm crazy, which I take as a badge of honor. And feel free to tell me I'm crazy there, Mr. Reeves. But let's get to it. Belmont, Donelson, or Henry, then Donelson. What is Grant doing in the first 3 or 4 months of 1862 that really no other Union general is doing?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. One is he's taking advantage of river transport, right? So he's being able to integrate the use of naval craft with his soldiers and moving them quickly to different points. But also, like at the Battle of Belmont, it's a great example of almost giving them a little experience. Like that sort of his soldiers are going to get better by being active. And so that's another thing. And so it's funny because Grant recognized the vulnerability of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And there's a great story where he goes down to St. Louis to tell Halleck, who's the Western commander at the time, to share his idea. And Halleck, who quite literally wrote the book on military tactics, said, I'm joking and paraphrasing, but you mean to tell me that? Eventually Halleck saw the light, and the Confederates had not defended these two forts strongly enough, and Grant achieves probably Donelson was the biggest victory in the war up until that point.
I was going to say what Grant is doing that no one else is doing is winning.
Yeah, exactly. And he's winning by not being hamstrung, by being active. And I think that was probably one of the things that we see early on, is that he would take manageable risks. And he was someone who would err on the side of activity as opposed to waiting until he had a certainty, because you might end up waiting quite a long time if you felt like the only time you acted was if you were guaranteed a win.
And he also knew that marching and that sort of those sorts of activities were good for morale.
Yeah.
They were good to impose and enforce discipline. And it was also a disease fighting measure because they weren't just sitting around in camps all day and night. They're moving about, getting exercise, going to different places. In February of 1862, Grant receives the surrender of Fort Henry, which was not a battle per se. And Fort Donelson happens just a few weeks later, I think.
Yeah.
But Fort Donelson, that victory brought Grant's name to the attention of everybody Grant needed to know for him to prosper.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I have a quote from Lord Byron, of all people, who one time said, "I awoke to find myself famous." And I think that's what happened with Grant. Is he goes from this obscure to winning. And Donelson really was. Sometimes we overstate these things, but Donelson was a huge strategic victory for the Union Army, opening up the Tennessee River. And this was finally, the Union had something to be excited about. And opening up the Cumberland River, And this activity in Western Tennessee was huge, and it brought Grant to the attention of the American public. And now, all of a sudden, though, the stakes are higher for him, right? And it was ironic that after the victory at Donelson, he gets himself into trouble with Halleck because he doesn't respond quickly enough to his communications. And Halleck starts whispering that maybe Grant is back to drinking again. And so it's funny that even Ulysses noted that what should have been his pinnacle had turned out that he was almost as if he was under arrest shortly after Fort Donelson. So huge strategic victory, but also not as smooth for his career as it might have been.
And rivers are more important in the West because they were highways to invasion, whereas in the East, they were impediments to invasion, which is one of the reasons. There are lots of reasons. You can look at the West, and a lot of the argument is the war was won there. And there's also so much more room to maneuver. And if you could have control of the rivers, then that was just an added element to your power that just didn't exist on the East, on the Rappahannock or the Rapidan or the Potomac. But I want to ask you about Halleck just for 30 seconds.
Sure.
I find him particularly loathsome. And I would wish I had been there when the person, whoever it was, said, "Oh, by the way, General Halleck, you're no longer General in Chief." In fact, Grant not only is going to be General in Chief, but he's also going to be the first merit 3-star general since George Washington. So, Henry, get used to it.
Yeah, my view on Halleck is a little different. So I'd say that some of his personal behaviors were indefensible. So, for example, the sort of whispering to McClellan, who was the senior figure, "Oh, it looks like Ulysses might be back on the bottle after Donelson," was really unacceptable gossip. And Grant didn't know about it until after the war, where somebody tracked down that correspondence, and he was stunned that he had been undermining him. By the same token, though, after Shiloh, where Grant was in hot water again, but this time with the public and a lot of politicians in Washington, Halleck defended. If Halleck wanted to get rid of Ulysses, he probably could have in the aftermath of Shiloh, but he didn't. And I think that, as maybe difficult a personality as Halleck was, I think he recognized that Grant had the battlefield leadership that he lacked, and that Halleck maybe had the administrative and the political skill that maybe Grant lacked, at least lacked in 1862 or 1863. And together they worked as a team in that respect.
And when Grant is General in Chief beginning in 1864, he keeps Halleck.
Yeah, he does.
And he could have gotten rid of him.
Because he sees him that he had his strengths from an administrative point of view. And I think when he would he usually offered an honest opinion, which as a leader, that counts for a lot, right? That he's not just trying to work an angle, but he would usually tell you what he really believed. So
you are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are talking to author John Reeves, discussing his book, Soldier of Destiny, Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. Shiloh. It's fought in early April 1862. As I said a few minutes ago, to me, it's the most impactful, meaningful battle of the war for what comes afterward. And if you were doing a counterfactual, what could have happened to the Union? Grant barely holds on, but emerges victorious, both tactically and strategically. Barely. What is your opinion of Shiloh as an overall battle in the context of the greater war? And how would you grade Grant's performance at Shiloh?
yeah, so I love this question. And I'm closer to you on this one as far as the importance of Shiloh. I'm excited to address this. For me, Shiloh's the most interesting battle, for sure. I just find it, you have so many fascinating characters there. You had Lew Wallace, for example, Grant said he got lost on day one and didn't get onto the battlefield. Wallace said he was given the wrong directions, he was given the wrong orders. And so there was that mix up. And then, of course, there's all these real iconic figures. Ambrose Bierce, the great writer, was in the ranks, along with Henry Stanley of the Stanley and Livingstone tale of Africa in the late 1900s. And of course, Albert Sidney Johnston is killed leading a brigade. So there's all these amazing events. But as far as the importance goes for Shiloh, I couldn't agree more with you that you basically, by defeating the Confederacy at Shiloh, you opened up northern Mississippi and the lower Mississippi River Valley to Union troops. And as the Union troops expand, the enslaved people start leaving the plantations of Mississippi. So it's a double blow to the Confederacy. And I think that was the blow that began the end of slavery in late 1862 and 1863. And that was made possible by that victory at Shiloh.
And let's go back to, go ahead.
And then just as far as the grade goes, I think that the journalist Whitelaw Reid got it right when he said Grant's performance before the Battle of Shiloh started was poor. But during the battle, just incredible leadership and courage and thinking quickly on his feet. Maybe it's a mixed result. He certainly was, in my opinion, caught by surprise at Shiloh. And it was a close battle, boy. And there were times on day one where it didn't look like the Union was going to win, but they held on. And one last thing I'll intend to conclude my long remarks, but it's extraordinary too that the Union it wasn't the prettiest victory in the world, but the results that flowed from victory at Shiloh did change the whole trajectory of the war.
And it's another spot, and we mentioned him a few minutes ago. To me, Shiloh really cements the friendship, the partnership between Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman.
Yeah, and I think that having been through that together that day, those 2 days, but that first day was the day that was a friendship that was forged in utter chaos, and that was the beginning of an incredible partnership.
We can't talk about Shiloh without giving a shout out to Mr. Prentice.
Yeah,
he just happens to be listening from heaven in his remarkable stand, Bloody Pond. And Shiloh, to me, proves the war is winnable if you're willing to make the sacrifice. There were more people killed, more casualties, so deaths plus injuries, in the Battle of Shiloh than in every single battle in American history up to that point. One scholar makes that.
Yeah.
Shiloh was the battle. We'll be home by Christmas. The Rebs can't fight. The Yanks can't fight. This will be a quick war. Shiloh destroys all of that just by the sheer ferocity and the casualties and the sanguinary nature of the battle. And to me, it's after that that both Grant and Sherman think, well, let me ask a question. Do you think that because of this battle, and the afterwards till surrender on April 9th, 1865, that Grant and Sherman believe it's going to be a harsh war and we have to fight it harshly and there's no other way around it?
Yeah, no, I think that Shiloh is the turning point. I think that Grant, and he even says in his letters prior to Shiloh that he thought that if they moved quickly, they could probably, that he thought that he could make this a shorter war if the Union was faster and more opportunistic. And I think Shiloh and after he realized, no, this is going to take a lot more than I had envisioned, because the Confederacy were able to, they fought well, they fought hard, they had more resources than maybe were considered, at least to begin with. And I think, yeah, I think both Sherman and Grant knew, and of course, it wasn't by late 1862 and early 1863, they were conducting the Vicksburg campaign, which, until they came up with a strategy, that had been a disaster. They were in that kind of learning mode, I think, in 1862 and early 1863, trying a lot of different things, but they certainly respected the South's ability to wage war.
You hit it right on the head. We'll move forward to the Vicksburg campaign. Vicksburg ends up surrendering, the Confederates do. John C. Pemberton on they surrender on July 4th. They initiate surrender on the 3rd, but the ceremony is the 4th. Is that right?
Yes.
So the same time the battle's happening in Gettysburg, Vicksburg is surrendering. You could say the South lost the Civil War in a span of 3 days in the summer of 63. But what you said earlier is so on point. Everything Grant tried to get at Vicksburg failed. And to me, it was a microcosm, a little bit of his life, because it just didn't matter how much he failed. He had faith in his ultimate success. And that's what happened.
Yeah. And I think Vicksburg is the perfect illustration of his willingness to take manageable risks. And Sherman, when Grant came up with the idea of, we're going to run the batteries, we're going to cross our troops over into Mississippi, and then we're going to come at Vicksburg from behind while keeping an eye on Joseph Johnston over in Jackson, who might be in our rear. Sherman thought that was the craziest thing he'd ever heard. But Grant, of course, was looking at each piece of that in and of itself, and each one of those moves was a manageable risk that could be defended. And he wasn't betting the whole campaign on a single throw of the dice. So when you look at how Grant brought about victory at Vicksburg, you can see a really wise kind of thinker, and then at the same time, a willingness to go toe-to-toe and to fight battles and expend losses if necessary. But he did have a vision of how that would be conducted. One of my favorite anecdotes, too, is afterwards when Lincoln writes to him and says,
beautiful letter.
Yeah, when you decided to go, I thought you should first meet up with Banks and before going north, but you went north, and I just wanted to let you know that you were right and I was wrong. And
I would like to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. Let me read this from your chapter 16 on Vicksburg, in which you're quoting someone else whom you don't identify. How is it that Grant, who was behind at Fort Henry, drunk at Donelson, surprised and whipped at Shiloh, and driven back from Oxford, Mississippi, is still in command? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, so that was passed on, that quote, and I would say it was passed on to the leadership, but from an observer in the field. He was in trouble after Shiloh, as I mentioned, and I would say that one of the reasons why he was able to hang in there was, and I noted this character, Congressman Washburn was his biggest advocate. And Washburn was friends with Lincoln. And so many times Washburn defended Grant on the floors of Congress and in the in the Oval Office with Lincoln. And so I think having patrons in high places was one way. But then Lincoln, of course, recognized that he needed someone who was going to fight, and it wouldn't be pretty at times. And I think I share the story in the book that Washburn had always been Grant's greatest defender. And at one point, Washburn, and it was during the Vicksburg campaign, lost his heart and said, "Oh gosh, sorry." And that's when Lincoln said, really is someone who sticks. He said something to the effect about Grant. He is a real stick-to-it fellow. So don't lose heart. So it was Washburn that was losing faith in Grant, and Lincoln had to buck him up. And I think that's where I think Lincoln, probably it was during the Vicksburg campaign that Lincoln realized that Grant was his guy. And
Grant had so many, we delineated, successful episodes of personal bravery. Let's say farming was a moderate success, but he had significant failures, both in his personal life and discipline, not infidelity, but with alcohol. His career in the Army didn't pan out. He certainly struggled for the time period before the war. His home life was wonderful with Julia, but less so when his dad or Julia's dad got involved. He had Halleck sniping at him, and he had the rebels to deal with. So it's reasonable to think that self-doubt would have been at least in the back of his mind as we go in towards the second half of the war. At what point during the war do you think General Grant felt comfortable, felt secure, felt like a success? This isn't all going to be taken away from me like so many other things.
Yeah, great question. I'd say it feels to me like, I think with confidence we can say after the Battle of Chattanooga that it was almost seen as he was the guy who was going to win the war for us. And he had reached that level of that height. I think that Grant never had doubts about himself, but others sure did. And during the early Vicksburg, that sort of early 1863, I think there was still danger that he could have been replaced or could have been superseded by someone else had the wrong person had Lincoln's ear or what have you. But I think that, so by late 1864, by late 1863 for sure, he's in a much stronger position. But I also think one of the things that makes him maybe unique is he did have tremendous self-belief. He of course couldn't convince other people might not see him, but I think he did believe in himself and felt he was the guy who should be. And I think he always had that too, or even early in the war, which makes him remarkable in that respect.
What happens before we end the podcast with the same 5 questions we ask all of our guests? They're harmless, I promise. Chattanooga gets overshadowed in a lot of ways, but it is a real watershed battle. It's in November of 63. It's after the Union was routed at Chickamauga. Grant now is given control of the entire Western Theater, not just one army. And he moves to Chattanooga with General Hooker, with General Sherman. General Thomas is still there. George Thomas is already there. Is this one of the turning points in the sense of, could Grant have survived a loss and still be kept in command? Lee famously turned in his resignation, I don't know, 4 times, 3 times. Offered to resign after Gettysburg. Generals were sacked all over the place, usually because they lost to Lee, which is somewhat ironic given how many times Lee wanted to go home. So he says, could Grant have survived a loss at Chattanooga and still have won the war? So
I think I love this question. It's obviously counterfactual. We'll never know for sure. But I do have a strong opinion. I feel that had he lost at Chattanooga, he would not have been made General-in-Chief of the United States Army. I think he probably would have continued to command the Western armies. I think that it would have been really hard for Lincoln to say, oh, the person who just lost at Chattanooga, I'm bringing him back east to oversee the Eastern Theater, which of course has been the bane of his existence for the entire war. And also remember that Meade had been wildly successful at Gettysburg. So the problem is that there was a culture of the Army Potomac that wasn't aggressive and didn't pursue Lee to the degree that Lincoln would have liked. And then also, though, he needed someone that was going to be the kind of conductor of all of the different theaters. I don't think it could have been Grant had he lost at Chattanooga. Lincoln would have done something else. Maybe he wouldn't have had that lieutenant general who could both be the strategic leader, but also someone who was on the field. Grant, during the Wilderness Campaign, was also right behind Meade and the Army of the Potomac on the battlefield. So anyway, great hypothetical, but it's hard to know for sure.
You end your book, plus Grant had enough pushback from going east and taking over after having won a signal victory. We can only imagine what the pushback would have been had he lost and been brought east. How much you end your book, you do not discuss the campaign, the Overland campaign, which I thought was interesting because, and I'm sitting here as I was reading it and I realized it was finished. I'm like, he's made his point. So there's no reason to go through there. And whether it's Noah Andre Trudeau or whomever, that has been written about a lot. And maybe you'll write a second volume to your book, which I would love to read and have you back on the podcast. But you didn't. You stop in the spring of 64. But let me ask a question, please, about the remaining year, 13 months. How much of the Grant legend is tied up, has its genesis in the fact that he bested Robert E. Lee?
Oh, I think a lot, too. I think a lot because my belief is that most of us, almost all of us, remember the myths of our history and not so much the details. And I think that the myth was that Grant was the one who defeated Lee. And the details might tell a more complex story, right? Lee had fewer resources and fewer men, and Lee made some tactically during the Wilderness Campaign made some smart decisions, and he was a formidable opponent. But nevertheless, Grant defeated Lee and received his surrender at Appomattox. And that's the kind of key to Grant, how we remember him. One of the things I wrote about in another book is that moment after the Wilderness where Grant says, we're continuing to go south. We're not retreating Burnside and Hooker and McClellan had on previous occasions. We're going to keep going despite having taken on these losses. And that's both the reality, but also the myth of Ulysses S. Grant doesn't turn back.
And the troops cheered.
Yeah. And I describe that in terms of, I think that was the moral courage that Grant possessed, meaning he recognized that this was a point in the war where the United States government and the United States Army had such a disproportionate amount of resources. It's that if someone was the person who could just push, we're going to win. And Grant took on that role and did what was necessary, which was meaning Lee couldn't replace his losses and Grant could. You know?
During this time, Grant was described by a fellow officer as, quote, I don't know, I'm tearing up. I just am such a fan of Grant. He habitually wears the look of a man who had determined to run his head through a brick wall and was about to do it. We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. John Reeves, are you ready?
Ready.
What was your first job?
Oh, first job, I was a paper boy. My father worked at a newspaper, and I would deliver the papers when I was 10 or 11 years old.
What was your first concert that you paid for?
The Outlaws, which was a country rock band. I grew up in Massachusetts in the 1970s, and it was at the Music Inn, which is across the street from Tanglewood in Western Massachusetts. And the Outlaws. I think the 90% of the concert was them doing Greengrass and High Times Forever, which was one of their hit songs.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh gosh, that is such a good one. And this is just a sort of an interest of mine at the moment. There's a great book by Thomas Powers. I don't know if you know who he is, but he wrote about the CIA. But when he was older, he did a personal project on the killing of Crazy Horse, the Lakota chieftain,
Right.
who was, of course, the victor at Little Bighorn. I just love the approach. It's very, he approaches it like an investigative journalist. So he's going back in time to figure out, okay, what actually happened and how was he killed? And it's just, I couldn't put the book down. So I highly recommend it to others.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh my gosh, my nerddom is going to really come out, but the Battle of Waterloo. I don't know. I'm just fascinated by. I would have loved to have been there to see.
You want to ride with the Prussians, or are you riding with the British?
Probably the British, I would have to say. But, hopefully, probably behind the lines. It was probably probably a pretty risky day to be out there. But no, I'm interested in that and just that period. I lived in London for many years and have been to Brussels a couple of times, but I've never been there. So I hope to visit there someday.
Number 5, if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Someone living today. That is such a good question. I'm going to have to, maybe because I'm a historian, maybe someone like Eric Foner, I think would be fun for me to talk to as a prominent historian who, I always want to learn and get better at what I do. So talking to someone who's achieved great success, because I think a lot of other politicians and corporate types, sure, those would all be good too, but I'd love to talk to a fellow historian who's.
Barack Obama is not the most famous, the most often selected guest, but I have to say that lately Paul McCartney is on his heels. I've had several people say I've been a Beatles fan since the 70s and 60s, and I just couldn't imagine. McCartney's pretty active these days on social media and doing interviews and stuff, so I think he's made himself a little bit more prominent. But
who came to mind right away was I'm Catholic and I grew up pretty Catholic, and I thought the Pope. And then I gave it more thought. I'm not sure what I would say.
That'd be great. As a fellow Catholic, I wouldn't mind being.
Yeah, no, it would be fun, but at the same time, I felt like I didn't know what I would be talking to.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been author John Reeves. His book, Soldier of Destiny, Slavery, Secession, and the Redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. It has received terrific reviews, and when you buy the book, which I highly hope that you will, you can read the reviews on the back. Mr. Reeves, thank you so much for coming on the podcast on a beautiful day where you are and giving me an hour of your time. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you on again.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It was fun.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.